In a world where success is measured by wealth, power, and status, one man's journey to find his true self and rebuild his empire begins. But the road is anything but easy. Betrayal, deceit, and personal loss await, threatening to tear everything apart. Meet Dylan Cross. A man who has clawed his way to the top, only to discover that the very people he trusted have turned against him. With everything on the line, he's about to face the toughest battle of his life, one that will challenge everything he believes in. In the cutthroat world of business, where alliances shift like sand and enemies hide behind smiles, Dylan will have to use everything he's learned, not just to survive, but to take back what's rightfully his. This is the story of resilience. Of overcoming the darkest of betrayals and finding strength in the face of adversity. This is Dylan Cross's journey to reclaim his life. Stay tuned as we dive into a tale of power, revenge, and redemption. If you're ready for a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts on what's coming next. Dylan Cross was a man who lived for the grind. A successful entrepreneur in his mid-30s, Dylan had always prided himself on his work ethic. He spent late nights perfecting his company, a tech startup that had quickly become the go-to solution for businesses worldwide. Despite the accolades and admiration from his colleagues, there was one person in his life who didn't seem to care about any of it. Ella, his wife, was beautiful, ambitious, and always seeking more. She was born into privilege, accustomed to luxury, and never satisfied with what she had. Her desire for more wealth, more status, more admiration, was a constant presence in their marriage. Dylan worked tirelessly to meet her demands, to give her the life she desired, but no matter what he achieved, it was never enough. As months turned into years, Dylan began to feel the strain. The long hours at the office left him little time for personal connections, especially with Ella. Her criticisms grew sharper, her expectations more unrealistic. She constantly compared him to her high-profile friends, making him feel inadequate. What was once a partnership based on mutual respect and love had now become a toxic relationship built on resentment. Dylan poured himself into his work, hoping that success would bridge the growing divide between him and Ella. He was negotiating a life-changing merger with a major corporation, TechWave, that could set his company on the map for good. But Ella didn't seem to care about his long hours or his dedication. Instead, she complained about his absence, citing his inability to provide her with the extravagant lifestyle she thought she deserved. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Dylan returned home to find Ella packing her bags. The news hit him like a wrecking ball. "I'm leaving," Ella said flatly. "I don't need you anymore. I've met someone who can give me what you can't." Dylan's heart sank as she dropped the bombshell. She had been seeing another man, an affluent investor named Luke Davis, who promised her everything Dylan could not. In that moment, all the sacrifices, all the years of hard work, seemed like they had been for nothing. He had given her everything, only to watch her walk away without a second glance. As the days passed, Dylan spiraled. The pain of betrayal was palpable. But even in his darkest moments, he knew that he couldn't let her have the final word. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and now, he had to rebuild. Dylan's response was not immediate. Instead of rushing into a confrontation, he took a step back. He reevaluated everything, his marriage, his company, and himself. It was time for him to take control of his life, to prove that he was more than just a man who could satisfy the whims of someone else. He focused on his company, working tirelessly on the merger with TechWave. While he worked through the details of the deal, Dylan's personal life was in shambles. Ella had moved in with Luke, and her demands for financial support only grew more outrageous. But Dylan was determined to prove that he could be successful, with or without her. As the merger went through, Dylan's company saw unprecedented growth. It wasn't just a financial windfall, it was the validation he needed. Dylan secured a deal that propelled his company to the forefront of the tech industry. But he was not done yet. He had one final move left, a legal one. In their divorce proceedings, Dylan took Ella to court. With the evidence of her emotional abuse, financial irresponsibility, and infidelity, Dylan's lawyer successfully argued that she should not receive a dime of the settlement. He had worked for everything, and now, it was time to take back what was rightfully his. The court ruling was swift and decisive. Dylan emerged victorious, securing his financial future and protecting his business from any further claims. Ella, on the other hand, was left empty-handed. Her lavish lifestyle came crashing down, and Luke, the man she thought could save her, began distancing himself as her financial demands grew unbearable. Dylan, however, found himself standing taller. He had weathered the storm and come out the other side stronger than ever. His company was flourishing, and he was now regarded as a visionary in the tech world. But it wasn't just about business anymore. Dylan had rediscovered his passion for life, for his friends, for his health. He reconnected with family members he had neglected, and slowly, the support system he had lost during the course of his marriage began to surround him again. Dylan was finally free. He no longer had to answer to anyone but himself. With his newfound confidence, he set his sights on creating something that would have a lasting impact, a foundation aimed at helping those who, like him, had been trapped in toxic relationships, those who had been abused or manipulated by people they loved. As for Ella, her life continued to spiral. Without the financial cushion Dylan had provided her, she was forced to live a life much less glamorous than the one she had hoped for. Luke, as predicted, grew tired of her entitled demands, and their relationship crumbled as quickly as it had started. But Dylan didn't look back. He had moved on from his past, from the person he was, and embraced the man he had become. Dylan sat at his sleek, modern desk in his downtown penthouse, overlooking the sprawling city below. His company, now a tech giant, had just launched a groundbreaking product that was set to revolutionize the way businesses operated. The boardroom was buzzing with excitement, but Dylan felt an unfamiliar emptiness in his chest. Though he had conquered the business world, built his empire, and won his freedom, something was missing. He had everything, wealth, success, respect, but at times, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still chasing something he couldn't quite grasp. He had done what most people only dreamed of, but he wasn't happy. His relationships were surface level. The friends who stuck around after the divorce weren't real friends, they were just people who admired his success. Dylan realized that in the pursuit of success, he had sacrificed the deeper connections he once valued. A few weeks later, Dylan received a call from his lawyer. It was a routine update about the final stages of his divorce settlement with Ella, but something about it felt off. The lawyer told him that Ella had filed for an appeal, citing new evidence that she claimed could turn the tide in her favor. Dylan frowned. Though he had won the case hands down, he knew Ella was relentless. She had nothing left but her pride and the desire for vengeance. The thought of being dragged back into her manipulative world angered him, but he wasn't afraid. This time, he had everything in place: his company, his reputation, and most importantly, his peace of mind. But he still couldn't shake the feeling of being caught in the web she had woven. He knew this wouldn't be the last time he'd have to deal with Ella. Her thirst for power and control wouldn't be sated so easily. But Dylan had changed. He wasn't the man who would buckle under pressure anymore. Dylan's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his office door. It was Rachel, his trusted COO, a no-nonsense woman who had been with him since the early days of his company. She was brilliant, driven, and completely loyal, qualities Dylan had come to value more than anything. "Got a minute?" Rachel asked, stepping into the room. "Of course," Dylan replied, turning his chair to face her. Rachel took a seat and set a tablet in front of him. "I've been thinking. With your company's latest success, we have the chance to do something bigger than just tech. We can change lives, we can create something that doesn't just make money, but impacts people. I've been researching social ventures, and I think you're in the perfect position to launch something groundbreaking." Dylan leaned forward, intrigued. "What are you thinking?" Rachel smiled, her eyes lighting up. We've all been through something difficult, you, me, everyone who's worked here. But what if we could create an initiative that helps people rebuild their lives? People who've been through betrayal, financial ruin, or just need a fresh start. We could offer funding, mentorship, and resources for people starting over. Dylan's mind raced. The idea struck a chord with him. He had spent so much time building his empire, but what if this was his true calling? To help others heal from the same kind of pain he had endured? What would it look like? Dylan asked, his curiosity piqued. Rachel leaned in. We could partner with organizations that focus on domestic abuse, financial literacy, and personal development. We can use our platform to offer more than just business advice. We could be the safety net for those who need it the most. Dylan sat back, processing her words. This was bigger than tech. It was about legacy. It was about leaving something real, something that could make a difference in the lives of others. Let's do it, he said finally. But let's make sure we do it right. As Dylan and Rachel began laying the groundwork for this new initiative, Ella's shadow loomed large once more. Dylan had hoped that the appeal would fade, but it didn't. The news broke that Ella had managed to secure a high-profile lawyer, someone with a reputation for turning cases around. Dylan knew she wasn't giving up easily. The media, as expected, latched onto the story. Headlines blared about the divorce battle of the century and the bitter fight for Dylan Cross's empire. Ella was playing her cards, leveraging public sympathy, and trying to turn the tide in her favor. But this time, Dylan was prepared. His company was stronger than ever, and he had no intention of letting his past define him. He met with his legal team, confident that this time, the battle would end once and for all. But there was something else on his mind. What if Ella wasn't the only one he needed to protect himself from? What if the world he had built, the high-powered business world, was just as corrupt, just as self-serving as Ella? Dylan knew that he had built a business empire, but he had yet to build a legacy. True redemption meant confronting not just his past relationship, but also the business world's hidden undercurrents, the politics, the deals made behind closed doors, the ruthless competition that sometimes blurred the line between right and wrong. As his new social venture began to take shape, Dylan had to navigate the very forces that had once held him back. There were investors to appease, competitors to outsmart, and corporate leaders to persuade. But this time, Dylan had a new weapon, his integrity. He was no longer driven solely by power or success. He had learned that success without purpose was empty. Now, he was determined to build something that truly mattered. As the months passed, Dylan's new venture began to make waves in the business world. His foundation, now formally called the Cross Foundation, helped hundreds of people get back on their feet. Entrepreneurs who had been financially broken, survivors of toxic relationships, and individuals struggling to rebuild their lives all benefited from the resources and support that Dylan had put into place. Ella, meanwhile, had lost her appeal and was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. No longer the object of public sympathy, she faded from the headlines as quickly as she had appeared. Dylan, on the other hand, found himself in a place of peace. He had built something that was bigger than himself, something that would leave a positive impact long after he was gone. But even as he looked to the future, Dylan knew there would be challenges ahead. There were still obstacles in the business world, new players to face, and the ever-present question of what legacy he would leave behind. And yet, for the first time in years, Dylan felt ready. Ready to face whatever came next. Ready to lead not just with ambition, but with purpose. As Dylan's philanthropic efforts began to take root, his company's success surged to even greater heights. The Cross Foundation was recognized as one of the most innovative charitable ventures in recent years. Dylan's name was no longer just synonymous with technology and wealth. Now, people saw him as someone who had genuinely changed lives, not just through profits, but through purpose. But while Dylan had achieved much in the business and philanthropic worlds, he quickly learned that true leadership often comes with more complexity. The more his influence expanded, the more he realized how much of the corporate world was still filled with shadows, and not everyone was as loyal as they seemed. Dylan sat across from his trusted advisor, Samira, in a sleek conference room that overlooked the city skyline. Samira, a sharp and seasoned strategist, had been with him since the early days of his company. She leaned forward, her expression serious. "You need to watch your back, Dylan," Samira warned. "I've been noticing some unusual activity with our investors and board members." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "What kind of activity?" "It's subtle," Samira replied. "Some of our biggest investors are starting to move their money into other ventures, competitors, without any explanation. And I'm hearing whispers about board members questioning your vision for the future." Dylan furrowed his brow, feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't the first time he'd sensed something was off in the business world, but now it felt more personal. The more he tried to do good, the more it seemed like the corporate world, with its hidden agendas, wanted to pull him back into its dark fold. "Who's behind this?" Dylan asked, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know yet," Samira replied, her voice tense. "But I've been digging, and we'll find out. Just, be prepared for the worst." The tension escalated quickly. A week later, Dylan called an emergency board meeting. His advisors, Samira included, warned him that the room would likely be filled with those who were ready to challenge him, people who saw his newfound focus on social impact as a distraction from the bottom line. As the meeting began, the room was heavy with anticipation. The board members, who had once praised Dylan for his vision and leadership, now seemed divided. Some sat quietly, while others exchanged subtle glances. Finally, Carter Gray, a longtime investor and one of Dylan's biggest supporters during the early days, spoke up. "Dylan," Carter began, his voice calm but firm. "Your heart is in the right place, but this whole social impact thing is costing us. We've seen a decline in profits over the past quarter, and our competitors are taking advantage of your shift in focus." Dylan remained calm, his eyes fixed on Carter. "You're right about one thing, my heart is in the right place. But my focus has always been to build something lasting. We're not just in the business of tech, we're in the business of changing lives. And I'm not going to stop just to appease short-term profits." Carter's jaw tightened. "That's noble, Dylan, but idealism won't pay the bills. The bottom line does. And you're putting all of us at risk." Dylan stood up, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Then I guess it's time to reassess who we're working for. If you're not on board with the direction I'm taking, then perhaps it's time to part ways." The room fell silent. For a moment, it seemed like the entire future of Dylan's company hung in the balance. Finally, Samira spoke, her voice strong. "I think what Dylan is saying is that we are at a crossroads. Either we evolve and remain a forward-thinking company that stands for something, or we continue down the path of being just another business obsessed with money." Dylan turned to Samira with a grateful nod. He wasn't alone in this battle. The tension in the room was palpable, but Dylan had made his decision. It was time for him to fully embrace the new direction, no matter what. He wasn't going to let anyone pull him back into the world of corporate greed and manipulation. It was about integrity now, and he was ready to fight for it. As the days passed, the cracks in Dylan's company grew more apparent. His team, which had once been united, was now divided. Samira continued her investigation into the mysterious investors, but the more she uncovered, the darker the truth became. Dylan received an anonymous tip one evening while he was working late. A cryptic email from an unknown source contained evidence of a large-scale embezzlement scheme involving some of his most trusted board members. They had been siphoning funds from the company's charitable division and redirecting them into their own pockets. Dylan felt a wave of betrayal wash over him. For a moment, the weight of everything, the lies, the deception, the people he had trusted, hit him like a tidal wave. "Samira," he muttered under his breath, before dialing her number. Within minutes, she was in his office, looking at the evidence with a sense of disbelief. "This is huge, Dylan. These people have been playing both sides, pocketing millions, all while pretending to support your vision." Dylan clenched his fists, his rage simmering beneath the surface. But instead of lashing out, he took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus. "We need to gather everything we can, but quietly. I won't let this destroy the foundation I've built. We'll expose them, but on our terms." The following days were a blur of covert meetings and calculated moves. Samira and Dylan worked tirelessly to gather the necessary evidence, all while maintaining the facade of normalcy in their public dealings. The board members involved, however, had no idea what was coming for them. When the time finally came, Dylan called another board meeting. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. As the members took their seats, they could sense something was wrong. Dylan stood at the head of the table, a calm but unwavering look on his face. "Before we move forward," he said, his voice steady, "I think it's time we address something." He slid a folder onto the table, the contents laid bare for all to see. The room went silent as the board members glanced at the incriminating documents. "The truth," Dylan continued, "will always come to light. It wasn't just the money that was at stake. It was the trust, the core of any successful venture." And Dylan had learned the hard way that trust was a currency more valuable than anything else in the world. The fallout was swift and severe. The implicated board members were removed, their assets frozen, and investigations into their fraudulent actions launched. Dylan had managed to navigate through yet another storm, but this time, it wasn't just a matter of protecting his company. It was a matter of standing up for the values he had always believed in. The media coverage was intense, and the public outcry was overwhelming. People praised Dylan for his decisiveness and integrity, while others saw it as a sign of his ruthless streak. But Dylan wasn't concerned with the opinions of others anymore. He was focused on building a future, one where power, influence, and wealth were tools for positive change. With the company now fully back on track, Dylan and his team turned their attention to what truly mattered, the people who would benefit from his work. The Cross Foundation grew, gaining recognition not just for its contributions to society but for its transparency and commitment to integrity. And as for Dylan, he had found peace. He had found his purpose, his direction, and his inner strength. There would always be challenges ahead, but he was no longer afraid of the battles. Because Dylan Cross had learned that the true measure of success wasn't in the power you held, but in the lives you changed along the way. The dust had barely settled after the corporate storm, but Dylan knew that life had a way of throwing new challenges his way. His reputation was now firmly established, both as a powerful tech mogul and a philanthropist. Yet, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his past hanging over him. The enemies he had made, both in the corporate world and in his personal life, weren't the type to stay quiet for long. One evening, while Dylan sat in his penthouse office, overlooking the bustling city below, a message popped up on his phone. It was from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. "I know what you did. Don't think you're done with this." The text was short, cryptic, and unnerving. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be someone from the old board, one of the corrupt investors, or someone he had crossed during his rise to power? Dylan's mind raced as he thought of the countless people who might want revenge or to expose him for the choices he had made. He quickly dismissed the thought. There was too much at stake now. His company, his reputation, everything he had fought for was now part of a larger game, one that would keep him on his toes. The next day, Dylan shared the message with Samira. She immediately sensed the gravity of the situation. They had survived corporate sabotage, but they had no idea who might be lurking in the shadows. "We can't ignore this," Samira said, her tone sharp. "We need to find out who sent this and why." Dylan nodded. He knew she was right. The last thing he needed was for someone to have leverage over him. He had spent too many years climbing, too many years cleaning up messes, only for someone to attempt to pull him back into the chaos. Samira was relentless. She tapped into every resource at her disposal, private investigators, cybersecurity experts, and even some of the more discreet contacts she had developed over the years. Days passed in a blur of information, meetings, and back and forth with various people. But the result was always the same, dead ends. However, one piece of the puzzle stood out. A name. Elliot Shaw. Elliot Shaw was a name Dylan hadn't heard in years. Shaw had been a close associate of his early on, a man Dylan had trusted and partnered with on several projects. But when Dylan began to expand his philanthropic endeavors and focus on giving back to the community, Shaw had been one of the first to distance himself. He had a different vision, a more profit-driven, cutthroat approach. After a falling out, the two men had severed ties, and Dylan hadn't given Shaw much thought since. It appeared that Shaw had taken a different route, one filled with dubious deals and unethical practices. In the years following their separation, Shaw had been involved in several shady business ventures that had been exposed by the media, earning him a reputation as a ruthless opportunist. But what was he after now? And why would he come after Dylan? Samira managed to track down Shaw's current location, a private villa on the outskirts of the city. Dylan, sensing that this could be the confrontation that had been brewing for months, knew that he had to face it head-on. He couldn't afford to let a ghost from his past haunt him any longer. With a sense of resolve, Dylan set the wheels in motion. The meeting was arranged, Shaw would face him, and they would have it out once and for all. The villa was luxurious, perched on the side of a cliff with panoramic views of the ocean below. As Dylan walked into the opulent space, he could feel the weight of Shaw's presence. Elliot Shaw was no longer the bright-eyed entrepreneur he had once been. Time had hardened him, and his once charming demeanor had given way to a more cynical, calculating man. "You've come a long way, Dylan," Shaw said, his voice smooth but edged with something darker. "I almost didn't expect to see you again. I thought you would have forgotten all about me." Dylan stood across from him, refusing to let the old memories cloud his judgment. "I don't forget people who try to pull me down. And I certainly don't forget those who send anonymous threats." Shaw smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're not as naive as I remember. You've learned well." Dylan's eyes narrowed. "What do you want, Elliot?" "I want what's mine," Shaw said, his tone growing colder. "You think you're in control now, don't you? But you're not. You think you've built something meaningful, but it's all just a house of cards waiting to collapse. I'm just here to remind you that it's not over." Dylan held his ground, every instinct screaming at him to stay calm. "You're wrong. It is over. This is your last attempt, Elliot. Whatever it is you're after, I'm not afraid of it." Shaw's smile faded, replaced by an almost predatory glare. "We'll see about that." In the days following the confrontation, Dylan knew he had made a powerful enemy. Shaw wasn't someone who would just vanish, and his words echoed in Dylan's mind. He needed to prepare for the storm that was undoubtedly coming. But for the first time in a long time, Dylan felt a sense of clarity. He had started his journey as a man who simply wanted success. Over the years, he had discovered that success meant far more than financial gain or corporate power. It was about legacy. It was about doing something with his life that mattered. Shaw might be a threat, but he was a symptom of a larger problem, a world where power, greed, and influence often ruled. Dylan's mission wasn't just to survive this battle, but to change the very systems that allowed men like Shaw to exist. And he would do it, not with force or manipulation, but with something much more powerful: truth, transparency, and integrity. Dylan stood on the rooftop of his office building, the city lights casting long shadows. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he was no longer afraid. In fact, he welcomed the challenges ahead. Because every challenge was a step closer to creating the kind of world he had always dreamed of, one where success was defined by what you gave, not what you took. He wasn't just fighting for his company anymore. He was fighting for something far greater. And no matter what Shaw or anyone else threw his way, Dylan was ready to face it, head on, with everything he had. Dylan sat in his office, his fingers drumming lightly on the polished wooden surface of his desk. The city lights glittered beyond the windows, casting long shadows across the room. But tonight, there was no comfort in the view. Tonight, Dylan had something far more pressing on his mind. After his confrontation with Elliot Shaw, the threat was no longer vague. Shaw had been circling, pulling strings behind the scenes to try to destabilize Dylan's empire. But it wasn't just Shaw anymore. New alliances had formed against Dylan, and old enemies had resurfaced. There were whispers in the market, subtle manipulations in the media, and even attempts to leak damaging information about Dylan's company. But Dylan had learned. He had prepared. The final confrontation loomed large. Dylan knew he couldn't face this alone. He reached out to those who had stood by him throughout his journey, Samira, Alex, and even the members of the board who still had faith in the company's mission. He wasn't going to let Shaw, or anyone else, take away what he had built. This time, he was not just fighting for himself but for everyone who believed in him and his vision. "I've been thinking about Shaw, and I don't think he's alone in this," Samira said during their strategy meeting. "We've underestimated the people who are backing him. We've been focused on him as an individual, but what if there's a larger network behind him?" Dylan nodded. "I've thought about that too. We need to take action fast before they can destabilize us further. Shaw has to be dealt with, and we need to make sure the financial system stays intact." Samira wasn't one for hesitations. "I'll get our lawyers on this. We'll follow the money. If Shaw's been funded by a larger group, we'll find out who they are." Dylan leaned forward, his mind sharp. "And we need to make sure that TechSource, my company, stays ahead of the game. I want all of our numbers to be transparent, no shady deals, no weak points for them to attack. Let's make it impossible for them to gain any ground." But just as the pieces started to fall into place, Dylan received an unexpected visitor. Alex, his most trusted ally, came to him with unsettling news. "I've been monitoring Shaw's movements," Alex said, his face tense. "There's something bigger going on here than we thought. Shaw's not just targeting you. He's made a deal with an anonymous investment firm that's trying to take over TechSource from the inside." Dylan's heart sank. The company he had worked so hard to build, the very empire that had come to represent everything he stood for, was now under threat in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I'll deal with Shaw," Dylan said, his voice cold. "But we need to move fast, Alex. We can't let this take over. If Shaw succeeds, it's not just my career on the line, it's everyone's." Alex's eyes locked with Dylan's. "You've been through a lot, Dylan. But this is different. If Shaw takes us down, it's not just a business failure, it's a personal attack. He's not just trying to ruin you, he's trying to erase everything you've built." Dylan nodded. He wasn't going to let that happen. Shaw had underestimated him once. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. The stage was set for the final battle. Dylan had mobilized his team, tightening his control over every aspect of TechSource. He knew that Shaw would try to use the press, manipulate stock prices, and destabilize the company from within. But this time, Dylan was prepared. He had learned from every misstep, from every betrayal. Samira had tracked down the people behind Shaw's operations. She discovered that the anonymous investment firm was run by a group of old competitors who had once tried to acquire TechSource during its early days. They had failed then, but now they had enough financial muscle to be dangerous. "I have a plan," Samira said one morning as she laid out the details. "We can expose Shaw's deal with the investment firm. If we go public with the right information, we can turn their tactics back on them." Dylan smiled. "Let's make them regret ever trying to mess with us." Dylan's final confrontation with Shaw was inevitable. The two men met once more, this time in a sleek conference room with an air of finality. Shaw's expression was calm, almost amused, as he leaned back in his chair. "You're still fighting, I see. I didn't expect anything less from you, Dylan." Dylan's voice was steady but sharp. "I didn't come here to talk about your plans, Elliot. I came here to end this. You think you can stop me? You've made some progress, but it's too late," Shaw replied, a smirk playing on his lips. "The investment firm I'm working with is already making moves behind the scenes. They'll control your company before you even know it." Dylan leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "You think you've won, but the truth always catches up, Elliot. And your investors? They're about to lose everything when we expose their dealings with you." Shaw's eyes flickered with unease. "You can't prove anything." "Watch me," Dylan replied. He signaled to Samira, who stepped forward with the evidence, emails, financial documents, and recordings of Shaw's dealings with the mysterious firm. The room was thick with tension as Shaw's bravado faltered. He knew the game was up. "You're finished," Dylan said. "You've underestimated me for the last time." The fallout from the exposure was swift and brutal. The investment firm that had supported Shaw was plunged into scandal, its leadership arrested for fraud and manipulation. Shaw's reputation, already tarnished, was now destroyed. TechSource, on the other hand, emerged stronger than ever. Dylan had not only protected his company, but he had also taken down those who sought to use their wealth and power for greed. His victory was not just a personal one, it was a victory for integrity in a corrupt world. As the dust settled, Dylan stood on the balcony of his penthouse, overlooking the city he had fought so hard to control. He had emerged victorious, but the victory came at a cost. There would always be new challenges, new threats, and new enemies. But Dylan was no longer afraid. He had built something far more valuable than wealth or power. He had built a legacy, one that would outlast the transient battles of the corporate world. He wasn't just a man fighting for success anymore. He was a man fighting for something far greater, a future where integrity, transparency, and the pursuit of a meaningful life would prevail. And for the first time in a long time, Dylan felt peace. The past was behind him, and the future was his to shape. Dylan Cross has faced betrayal, survived his darkest moments, and is now on the brink of a new beginning. But like every story, the journey isn't over. What lies ahead? Only time will tell. This is just the beginning of Dylan's story. What do you think will happen next? Will he soar higher, or will the shadows of his past continue to haunt him? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and can't wait to see what happens next, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of the action. Join us on the next chapter of this incredible journey. Thanks for watching, and remember, every story has a twist. And Dylan's story is just beginning.